I'm talking today about some work that I'm trying to do to bridge the academic sphere with the social movement sphere. I'm a scholar of social movements. I was very heartened to watch, in response to police brutality, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to not just police brutality, but the general assault on the black body in post-civil rights America. Of course, we know that Black Lives Matter started in the wake of the Trayvon Martin shooting, where George Zimmerman was acquitted. The three women who started the movement by posting the hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter just really encapsulated all of our frustrations with the way that black bodies are abused in American society. And so I want to preface my comments by saying I started down the path of doing empirical research on Black Lives Matter because I see it as a continuation of our long struggle in this country. I had my first experience with police brutality driving around this campus, not too far from here, when I was lost trying to find the tennis courts because we had a match against Emory, and getting kind of pulled over and having a gun pulled on me because I had a blown out tail light on the car that my parents had sent me down to college with, right? I also integrated my neighborhood, or helped integrate my neighborhood in New Jersey in the 1970s, and just remembering the kind of daily physical trauma that ensued with that work of completing the work of Brown, right? And so I think that we got somewhat comfortable in this country for a couple of decades. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is a response to the fact that we probably never should have been as comfortable as we were, and just watching young people, particularly millennials, push the envelope and move forward in leadership on these issues is something that's really heartened me. And we've had a lot of academic assessments of the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of it is similar to what I've just done, which is praise the movement. But what I want to do today is present you some empirical findings on how the movement's functioning, and I want to raise the question, is it winning? Are we having success? Is it moving the metric? And so what does winning mean? Social movement scholars have a very sort of well-defined notion or idea of what winning is, and that movement comes from the long African-American civil rights movement of the 20th century, right, which is really one of the only modern movements to change laws, right? We've had a lot of social movements in the West, in democratic cultures of the West. Most are failures. Most don't change anything. Most don't rally a lot of people. Most don't get favorable media coverage. Most don't change hearts and minds, right? The African-American civil rights movement in the 20th century did all of those things, right? And so I think that we have done, we have a memory of perhaps one of the most successful movements for democratic freedom in the world that has structured the way that social movement studies has treated movements. And I think part of the dilemma as scholars is how do we gauge this new movement that is explicitly trying to do similar things but many different things, and to do it in ways that are in some ways more open and tolerant of difference and dissent, tolerant of different kinds of black bodies, encouraging of different kinds of black bodies. How do we do all that work and figure out if it's having any success? And so that's what my intellectual challenge has been over the last couple years. So I'm going to frame out the talk in this way. I'll talk about the origins of the movement briefly. I'll talk about the movement at 6. Most social movement scholars, we have something called a social movement cycle. What we suggest is that if you don't get your basic goals between 5 and 10 years after the founding of your movement, then you failed, right? And so the Black Lives Matter movement is at 6 years old, so it's time to be doing assessments of what's happening, right? Normally when movements die, they become co-opted by a power elite, people just stop turning up, or they become institutionalized. And we need to ask, is any of that happening with BLM, right? I'll talk about some of the theories of the movement, I'll expound on what I just said, and then I'll talk about my 3 empirical studies that I'm going to show you today. how BLM communicates on Twitter. So one way that I want to define if they're winning is, are they communicating clearly? Are they sending what we call in neoclassical economics and quantitative political science, are they signaling? Are they playing a signaling game that is consistent or correct with what they claim to be their values, right? And so Twitter is the new technology for the BLM movement in the way that television and radio were new technologies for the long civil rights movement. So the question that I want to ask is, does the BLM movement's signaling line up with their proposed values, purported values? And more importantly, does that signaling translate into sort of a boost in positive media coverage and the way that people, African Americans, feel about the movement? So I'll talk about media coverage. One of the ways that movements win is by getting the media to like them and to write favorable things about them, right? So has BLM done that? Are there differences between the African American controlled media or the white media, right, or AKA mainstream media, right? Are there differences about how they appraise and assess the movement? And then finally, I was struck when I started this project in 2017 that 4 years into the Black Lives Matter movement's life, there was not a national survey on how African Americans were appraising the movement. Right? Now there are some. My colleague is part of the CMPS study, which has 4 or 5 Black Lives Matter movement questions on it, a big national omnibus survey coming out of UCLA about black politics. But I wanted to do a survey focused just on Black Lives Matter. And so that was the first survey of the Public Research Center that I started in 2017 called the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy, or CSDD. So let's get more into it. You all probably know that the origins of the movement is in the work and labor of these 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They posted hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. What you should know is that the hashtag Black Lives Matter is one of the 2 or 3 most successful, most tweeted hashtags in the history of Twitter. Something on the order of 70 million usages, right, or tweets. And so this is an incredibly sort of prolific hashtag. If you want to know more about that, Dean Freelon at American University, a brilliant communications scholar, has done really fantastic work about the amplification of the hashtag and how it has boosted mobilization, right? Black Lives Matter became a slogan and organizing principle for 35 grassroots protests that erupted in response to the deaths of Eric Garner in New York City and Michael Brown in Ferguson in the summer of 2014. And it began to register in the national consciousness in public opinion polls that early. Estimates of the number of BLM protests that have taken place since 2014 range from 100 to 2,500. Right? I think it's probably closer to 2,500. I know I told the story at lunch yesterday. My students and some high school students from Evanston did a great Black Lives Matter protest. They stopped traffic right in front of my office there in Evanston. There were no media there covering that. Evanston doesn't have a newspaper, right, except for the campus newspaper. And so I suspect that the number is closer to 2,500, but we just don't know because there's no one counting. The only ones that get counted are when BLM Chicago goes and stops traffic on the Kennedy Expressway, or in New York City shuts down the BQE. Those are counted. But what about all of the wonderful local energy that's being manifest by this movement? We don't have a local media anymore. We have large corporate media controlled by conglomerates. A lot of them are right-wing, right? Even your beloved MSNBC is owned by Cabletown, right? The right-wing, and so you see the shift there in the way that they cover certain subjects. The Sinclair Group and what they've done with the consolidation of local media, that means that these stories are not getting out there. They're not being counted. They're being suppressed, more likely, right? So I'm going to say, let's take a conservative estimate and say it's somewhere in between 100 and 2,500, but closer to 2,500, right? So there are 4 theories of the way that the Black Lives Matter movement is operating that have emerged in the social science literature. There's the historical continuation of the long civil rights movement thesis. This is been proposed by Chris LeBron, a philosopher at Johns Hopkins University, and Megan Francis, a wonderful American political development and criminal justice scholar at the University of Washington. What they do is they track the themes and the issues and the ideological constructs of the elites that are participating in the Black Lives Matter movement, and they see a lot of contiguous ideological behavior. And what they say is that this is just the latest in this kind of long tradition of blacks on the ground organizing to defend their bodies from state violence and white supremacist violence, right? And so that's the kind of broad brush. There's a neo-Marxian or class politics thesis espoused most convincingly by a brilliant book written by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who's at Princeton University. And what she argues is that the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly the Ferguson uprising, is the manifestation of a long simmering class conflict between low-income African Americans left behind in urban centers that have been neglected by the white power structure and black elites for the last 30 years. And that these people are mobilizing to demonstrate their displeasure not only with white supremacist violence, but also with the failings of, and again, Keeanga's the messenger here, don't get mad at me, but I'm going to say, right? I'm just a scholar drawing some things together. Keeanga says squarely, she's also a Northwestern PhD, by the way, not my student, but just one of, we're all proud of what she's done. But she says squarely that the frustrations and the failings of the Obama administration to deal with racial inequality is part of what has led to the manifestation of the Black Lives Matter movement. Then there's the feminist and LGBTQ plus politics thesis advanced by Trevor Lindsay and Barbara Ransby, that this is really the work of queer black women who are responding in part to the assault on black women's bodies, both within the black community, but also the way that state violence facilitates that and never punishes or prosecutes black men in ways that they should. And it's about elevating queer bodies and trans people, centering the most marginal, right? And I think the dominant view among social movement scholars is that it's really somewhat all of these things, and that they can be encompassed most parsimoniously in the view of the new social movement scholars. In the 1980s and 90s in Europe, a bunch of ephemeral movements rose up and they challenged the power structure, not in traditional ways, by marching and trying to change laws, but just by expressing their frustration and demonstrating, trying to manifest a new culture, right? So new social movement scholars argue that this movement is really more about performing positive black identities and ideologies than changing laws, than getting elites to do anything. It's about demonstrating the illegitimacy of the power structure, right? And so we can't judge the movement based on the old standards of social movement theory, right? Now, what I'm trying to do by introducing this, well, our colleague Fred Harris, who's now a fancy dean at Columbia, but he wrote one of the most important papers on this in 2015. He was one of the first to argue this point. Keeanga Taylor argued in her book that it's the Occupy movement is really a big part of the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement, because black participants in the Occupy movement picked up a lot of the tactics of the new social movement style from Occupy and just translated that over to BLM, right? And so this is a kind of a controversial argument that Fred Harris and Boris Rickford made in 2016 paper, because scholars of race in social movement studies have historically thought that the new social movement theories only applied to white groups. It had never been applied to a movement for racial justice, right? That it was about Europe, it's about, you know, clean power and environmental sort of rights. And so the friction in scholars of race is that I've told you at the outset that the African American movement is the paradigmatic movement of changing policy and succeeding. And so we have people like Alvin Morris, is probably one of the most prolific, he's current president of the ASA, I think. Most prolific social movement scholars, people, in the resource mobilization field of social movement studies, who said that Black Americans won by getting rank and file people to show up, to give donations from their little meager salaries to this movement, to put their bodies on the line, to be beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's directed toward a purpose of freedom. So they had always resisted the notion that Black people would do anything that's just performative or symbolic or not about changing laws, right? And so by making this argument that this is happening in the Black community, it's not one that a lot of the first wave of really influential Black social movement scholars are ready to embrace, right? So I'm entering at the crossroads here with my work, which is empirical, and trying to get a sense of what's really happening on the ground. How can we assess this? When we look at what the leaders say, the so-called leaders, now we have to put that in scare quotes, because the women that started the movement, they don't describe themselves as leaders. They describe themselves as conveners or facilitators. One of the hallmarks of a new social movement is that there's no explicit top-down leadership. And so they've rejected that concept. Now, America has made them leaders by giving them press opportunities and big awards and paying them $50,000, $60,000 for speaking engagements at universities. And so one of the dividing lines that we have to deal with is, are you a leader when other people say you're a leader? And you say no? You're not a leader, right? Or are you a leader when there's a kind of hierarchical, charismatic, top-down sort of trajectory to your movement, right? And so I'm very well aware of that. So what I'm saying is the people that the media focus on and that scholars focus on as directing this movement, they say that they are about, the labor and love of queer Black women, advancing the most marginal, centering the most marginal lives, disavowing respectability politics, disavowing middle-class standards for, Black life, right? The Bill Cosby model of what we should be doing, right? And so, yeah. And so that model lines up with the scholarly consensus on the new social movement theory. New social movement theorists say that this performative nature is at the foundation of new social movements. They're aimed at expressing or performing claims around race, gender, LGBTQ identities, more than winning materialist gains or shaping political processes. And they tend to use the politics of disruption, right? Interrupting traffic, lunches, more than the old resource mobilization in the political process model was, we make a disruption only so we can then go back and negotiate with the power structure to change laws, right? The Black Lives Matter folks are disrupting and then disbanding. They're not interested in talking to leaders necessarily. This is how they describe the movement themselves, right? So what I've tried to do with my research agenda is take a look at the three domains that social movement scholars have typically judged movements on: messaging or signaling. Does the movement message in a way that's consistent with the values that it, claims in interviews and other media engagements to purport? Public opinion. Has it moved, has it registered and moved the public consciousness? Particularly, what I'm trying to do this different is, has it moved the Black consciousness, right? And then political behavior. Are there messages translating into behaviors that boost Black participation, both in the movements, but voting is still important, y'all, right? So the old movement had a huge impact on these traditional forms of political behavior, writing to members of Congress, voting, etc. Black Lives Matter's sort of, elite cadre of conveners suggest that they're not really trying to do those things, right? But just because they're not trying to do it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And so what I want to find out is, do African Americans that support and like the BLM movement, are they more likely to vote? Are they more likely to bring others to the voting booth, right? And so I found some really interesting and confounding findings, right? So on the messaging part, what I found is that BLM communicates on Twitter in ways that don't necessarily line up with what the women that started the movement and many of the top leaders of the movement suggest they should be doing. What I found in my analysis, and again, this is just a snapshot of tweets. I studied, I had a team of 3 undergraduate coders and a graduate student project manager. They've read 18,708 tweets over a period of 15 months. These are tweets that span from January of 2015 up to the month before the presidential election of 2016. What I wanted to know is, did BLM take any stance on these elections or candidates, right? I wanted to get a sense of, the politics. Now, I'm currently, I have a larger team that's trying to code every tweet that is emanated from 5 Black Lives Matter accounts. So what I've done is I've coded the main Black Lives Matter account and then some regional ones. Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., and then Ferguson Action, right? I wanted to see if there's variation within what they're tweeting about. And so what I found is that if we take Garza at her word that it's a movement rooted in the labor and love of queer black women, the same piece she says that it's about elevating the personhood and lives of queer African Americans and trans African Americans. I expected to find a lot of tweets framed about LGBTQ plus issues. I expected to find a lot of tweets framed about women's issues and feminist politics. That's not what I found. Instead, what I found is that the majority of the tweets in this sample, and again, this might be overturned. We're going to get through about another 50,000 tweets, right? But I wanted to know, in a political cycle, what message are they sending? And what I found is that they're mostly tweeting about individual rights. We have a right to protest, First Amendment right. We have a right to be free of state violence. My body is, sort of sacred, right? So what we would call liberal frames, not in the sense of liberal, conservative, partisan politics, but frames focused on individual rights to live, breathe, walk down the street are the dominant frames. Now, the New Social Movement scholars say that New Social Movements talk a lot about culture, music, art, and I did find that 13% of the frames are about culture, right? A lot of frames about, the activist work of certain hip-hop stars, Chance the Rapper, or Beyonce, right? These things are really registering in the tweets. So more in the messaging studies. I wanted to know how effective BLM is at turning Twitter to organizing protests. Again, the difference between the long civil rights movement is that they really focused on these systemic political outcomes. It's about getting people to the polls and the vote, and about groups like the NAACP and the Urban League have stayed with that message, right? I expected most of the tweets from the BLM groups to be about protest action. We're meeting on Cameron Road at 12:45 to protest state violence. What I found is that the overwhelming majority, 88% of the tweets in this sample, are urging people to register to vote, are urging people to write to their local city council member or school board member. So they are an engine for local politics in particular and electoral politics. This is a very surprising finding. Media studies. What I wanted to know is, how is the media judging and appraising Black Lives Matter? So we analyzed 1,571 articles, another team, between 2013 and 2017. We've completed an additional 1,100 from this point up to June of 2019. My guy does not have all that tabulated yet, so I couldn't extend the chart. But what we found is that when we look at black-controlled media, 42% of the articles, when you ask what the tone is, tone options are they positive about the movement? Are they neutral about the movement? Are they negative? You can see that 42% are positive, only 7% are negative. You wouldn't, expect anything else. But 50% are neutral. They're not sure if BLM is winning, if BLM is making a difference, right? So I wanted to know if the white media is more critical. And what we found is that it's a pretty even split. The mainstream, aka white-controlled media, 45% are neutral, 10% are negative, 44% are positive. And so we've got a pretty rough split within the media writ large. There's not a huge gap between the way the black-controlled and white-controlled media see the movement, and no one's really sure if it's winning, right? And this is something that I've got into some great debates with actual BLM protesters about what this means and how they should rethink about their messaging strategies, right? When we looked at the particular question of success rates, right? So not just overall tone, positive, neutral, negative, but do you believe that the movement is winning? We asked that question directly. We look for language tantamount to winning or having an impact. In the black-controlled media, I'm sorry, in the white-controlled media, only 15% see the movement as winning on its issues. The vast majority are neutral. 7% see it as losing. Pretty good comparison with the black-controlled success rates. The vast majority say that it's winning. 15% say it's winning. The vast majority are neutral. Only 9% say that it's losing. So what about the public opinion studies? What we know is that from organizations like Gallup that do surveys about black life with only 75 to 150 black respondents and say that's a national sample, right? Because we're doing a randomized model. What we know is that when you look at, Gallup surveys, we've seen very racially polarized responses to the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a Pew study from 2016, in February through March of 2016. And they found a large partisan divide on support for the Black Lives Matter movement among whites. And so, not surprisingly, only 4% of Republicans strongly support Black Lives Matter. So it's probably the 2 or 3 African American Republicans, two or three New England Republicans left in places like Massachusetts. Yes, of course I support Black Lives Matter, right? There's a Republican guy in my neighborhood that's got a Black Lives Matter sign in his yard because he goes to the Unitarian Church and they're really pro-Black Lives Matter, right? And so when we look, the vast majority of Republicans, white Republicans, oppose it. Democrats, 29% strongly support, 35% somewhat support, right? And then independents, are somewhere in the middle between these two polarized extremes. And so what I wanted to do was to see what African Americans thought of this movement. And so we did a survey in 2017 through Qualtrics panels. It's a 25-item online survey. It interviewed 815 African Americans about their impressions of the leadership structure and effectiveness of the Black Lives Matter movement. The survey was fielded from September 22nd, 2017 to October 4th, 2017. That's very important for one of the responses that you're going to see. So just keep that in mind that this is prime football season. Andra took me to a football game yesterday. It was sort of, again, Emory knows how to host, I tell you what. It wasn't an Emory football game either. I saw the dirty bird in action, which is very exciting. But keep in mind when this survey was fielded, okay? So what I did was, because it's an internet survey, you can't really get very good readings on error in internet surveys. We weighted the survey to look just like what we do in a random digit dial-in telephone survey. So what that means is that the survey respondents the gender distribution was 50% male, so that's a mistake, it should be flipped. Qualtrics will give me my money back, but what we found is that, there are more women in the population in general, but on this internet distribution in this panel, more men belong in Qualtrics panels. 49.3% were female. 815 respondents, they lived in 39 of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. 50% of the respondents earned between $30K and $75,000, so that's a very good for income distribution. 18% earned less than $20K per annum. 12% earned more than $100K. 25% of the respondents were high school dropouts. 32% were high school graduates. 26% held a 4-year college degree, so that's slightly more than the national average. It's actually about double, right? The reason for that is that people that use the internet more, have more access to the internet, are more college educated. So in all of these internet panel samples, you're going to get slightly more college educated folks than you would in a random digit survey. 49% of the respondents described their neighborhood as urban, 39% described their neighborhood as suburban, 12% live in rural areas. So what did they say? Did they like Black Lives Matter? 81% of the respondents see BLM as at least moderately effective. 52% describe the movement as either very effective or extremely effective. 59% believe that BLM movement is providing economic opportunities for African Americans. 56% see the movement as effective advocate for LGBTQ rights. 63% think that BLM is effective at protecting Black Americans from police brutality. And 68% of respondents describe BLM as effective at protecting voting rights of African Americans. 67% see it as improving race relations. That's certainly wrong. And 61% of respondents saw BLM as effective at promoting gender equality in the U.S. Now, I told you that this was done during football season. We wanted to get at this leadership question. We wanted to see if the Black American community had a kind of gendered response to who should be your leader, right? Because part of what BLM is doing is they're responding to the kind of male, charismatic leadership dilemma of the long civil rights movement. And what we found is that Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, Alicia's at 10%. We found DeRay McKesson, who ran for mayor of Baltimore and got 3% of the votes, but gets a lot of media attention. 8% thought he should be the leader. Colin Kaepernick, 27%. This is in the height of Donald Trump attacking him over the Take a Knee protests, right? And so what was also interesting is that a lot of the respondents wanted people in their local communities that we had never heard of, right? And so that might be a way that the movement is succeeding, is that local homegrown leaderships are in the front of the minds of these people. I know I've got about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to move through a couple other things very quickly. The behavioral studies. This is Greek to everyone, including me. Don't even worry about this. And what I'm going to do is what I want you to know. These are statistically significant predictors of people's going out to participate in the Black Lives Matter movement. These are what we call the control variables. The dependent variable is, did you protest? Did you go out? And so these are things that like age, education, gender, Hispanic heritage, income, Black consciousness, liberalism, like how Black are you? Is it really important to you to be Black? Right? Liberalism. Do you consider yourself to be a liberal, a moderate, or a conservative? Linked fate. Does the fate of what happens to other Black people impact your life? Right? These are big, standard public opinion metrics, right? So all I want you to pay attention to is these asterisks. What these mean, if you have 3, it means it's significant at the 0.01 level, right? So that's about a 99% chance that something is right there, right? The ones with 2 That's the 0.05 level, right? About 95% confidence interval. The ones that don't have anything next to it are not statistically significant, right? And that's the constant, that doesn't matter. R squared is how well the model is predicting the dependent variable. So let's just focus on this one. This is the second regression that's got all of these things in there. What we find is that the older you get, the less likely you are to participate in a Black Lives Matter protest. Not shocking. The more educated you are, the less likely you are to participate in a Black Lives Matter protest. Remember what Keonga Taylor said, right? Now this is the one that Alicia Garza and the conveners are not happy with when they see this survey. It's supposed to be a movement of women, but what this study and another study that I've done has found is that the modal protester in these movements is a black man between the ages of 18 and 24. Right? Now there might be a lot of reasons for that, right? And we can talk about that. But gender, the move from 0, because I'm a good feminist academic, I always code in my samples, men are 0, women are 1, right? And so when we went to school, Andrea was taught the other way, right? Men are always the 1, right? And so the move from 0 to 1 in this data makes you less likely to go out and protest, right? This was really fascinating. Hispanic heritage, only about 3 or 4% of the sample had Hispanic heritage, the Latinos. In this sample, they were going out to protest more when you don't control for these political variables, right? And that's another paper that I'm working on. Income, that's the big one. The higher your income, the less likely you are to go out and protest, right? So let's forget about these numbers and let's just put it up on a chart. If 0 is not participating, right, and this is positive participation, this is negative participation, we can see the impact in the model around the 95% confidence interval that, you know, each variable is having. Older is less likely, higher income is less likely, higher education is less likely. Believing that blackness is really important to you is surprisingly slightly less likely. Having a strong sense of linked fate makes you more likely to protest. What's interesting is that the people with lower class socioeconomic status had higher degrees of linked fate. This is a finding that flips everything that we've known about black public opinion on its head. Let me race through a couple things and shut up so that we can do a Q&A, which is going to be much more interesting than what I'm saying. And so, are they winning? They're certainly winning on black public opinion. White public opinion is mixed, right? Depends on if they're Democrat or Republican. Media commentary, they seem to be winning, right? Because no one is willing to say that they're losing, right? Like social movement scholars, where's the laws? They haven't done anything, right? Their own messaging is mixed, right? When I present this to BLM audiences, they're like, oh, we're not tweeting, we're not elevating the lives of these, we got to get on Twitter and do more, right? And so, and then policy outcomes, it's mixed. I think that they have had a real impact on certain elections, right? In Chicago, my hometown, we got a prosecutor because BLM mobilized people to vote for her. I also want to note that since BLM protests have stopped, shootings have not declined, but they've leveled off, in part because I think people know that these cameras are everywhere, right? And so that's it. That's my sort of assessment of where I am on this project. So I just want to do one more slide, which is thank you, Emory, and especially Dr. Andrea Gillespie. So.